Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're embarking on quite a journey, I think, a really deep plunge into the ancient past.
We are indeed.
We're going to explore one of history's most, well, remarkable examples of connectivity and enterprise, the Phoenician trade network.
That's right. We've been digging into a collection of sources you shared, and there's a particularly compelling thesis in there that really unpacks this vast maritime system.
Especially its peak period, right? Like ninth to 6th centuries BCE.
Exactly that period. It's fascinating stuff.
So our mission, as always here, is to, cut through the complexities, pull up the key findings, the connections, maybe some surprising details.
About how sophisticated this ancient network really was.
Right. We need to picture this world recovering from a major collapse, piecing itself back together.
And these seafaring people, the Phoenicians, reestablishing connections across the Mediterranean, even beyond, driven by trade, by exploration.
And the scale is just huge from their homeland in the Levant.
Tiny strip of land, really.
All the way across the sea, hitting islands and reaching the Atlantic coasts. It's quite something.
Breathtaking, really, when you map it out.
Okay, let's dive in. To really get the Phoenician trade network, we need to understand where it came from, right? Its origins. It didn't just spring up out of nowhere.
Absolutely not. It had roots. The story really kicks off with a massive shakeup at the end of the Bronze Age, around the 12th century BCE.
A time of collapse, disruptions.
Widespread disruption, yeah.
Yeah.
Across the Eastern Mediterranean, we're talking about major kingdoms falling apart. Mycenaeans in Greece, the Hittites.
What caused it? Internal stuff, external pressure.
A mix, probably. Internal weaknesses, maybe social unrest, climate issues, compounded by external factors like migrating groups. The famous sea peoples often get mentioned here.
Right, the sea people, so chaos. But amidst that, the Syro-Canaanites, the people who'd become the Phoenicians, they were still there on the coast.
They were the survivors, in a way. Remnants of these older maritime cultures from the late Bronze Age. And they held on to that memory, that knowledge of the sea.
The memory of trade being important.
Precisely. Seafaring trade was absolutely vital in the late Bronze Age, connecting the Levant with Egypt, Cyprus, the Aegean. That cultural know-how, it didn't just vanish.
And there's actual archaeological evidence for this continuity. It wasn't a complete break.
That's a key point from the research, yes. Even during that transition, that sort of dark age period, the archaeology suggests some sea links persisted. Unbroken connections, it seems, between places like Cyprus, Sarepta on the coast, and Tyre.
Wow, so even while empires crumbled, these specific coastal spots kept some lines open.
Kept some connection going, yeah. Resilient little nodes in a fragmenting world.
So these early Iron Age Canaanites adapt, focus on the sea, and they become known as the Phoenicians.
That's the term we use, yeah, from the Greek Phoenikes.
Ah.
And geographically, they were squeezed, weren't they? A narrow coastal strip, Lebanon mountains behind, the Med in front.
Limited land. Not much choice but to look outwards.
It certainly pushed their focus onto the sea, yeah. That was their main avenue for resources, for wealth.
Masters of the waves, as the saying goes. And they didn't just scrape by, they bounced back incredibly quickly. By the 10th century BCE, they're major players again.
It is striking how fast they reemerged. We see signs of this not just in archaeology, but also in texts from their neighbors.
Like the Bible.
Like the biblical accounts, exactly. The relationship between King Hiram of Tyre and King Solomon of Israel.
Right, trading cedar wood, metals.
Significant trade, yes. And even mentions of joint sea voyages, the ships of Tarshish expeditions. That implies pretty sophisticated maritime capabilities, maybe long distance, already by the 10th century.
That literary evidence is crucial then for seeing their early reputation. And the sources suggest this resurgence might have been fueled by a mix of things, old skills and new ideas.
That blend seems likely. That deep inherited seafaring knowledge may be combined with new techniques or ideas brought in by settlers or groups interacting during that post-collapse reshuffle.
Adaptation, not just preservation.
Exactly. And technology played a part. The brailed sail technology is mentioned as vital. It appears near the end of the late Bronze Age.
Brailed sails. Okay, explain that. How does that help?
Well, basically, it uses ropes, the brails running from the bottom edge of the sail up to the yardarm.
Ah, so you can pull up sections of the sail.
Precisely. It gives you much more control over the sail area, the shape. You can handle different winds better, sail closer to the wind than the older square sails. More flexibility, more control.
Okay, that's a big advantage. Hard to find archaeological proof of ropes, I guess.
Very rare. But we have iconography depictions in art
Carvings, reliefs.
Yes.
Yeah.
From places like the Tomb of Kinamun in Egypt or Relief PC 103. They show ships with features we associate with Syro-Canaanite vessels, visual clues.
And another bit of tech mentioned is the crow's nest. That seems surprisingly early.
It does, but the research suggests its use might go back to the late Bronze Age.
Yeah.
And you see it depicted quite often in Eastern Mediterranean seafaring art.
Just that high platform for a lookout.
That's it. Simple, but incredibly effective. A higher viewpoint helps spot land, hazards, weather changes, other ships. Crucial for navigation and safety way back then.
So resilience, deep knowledge, key tech like brailed sails and crow's nests, that sets the stage for understanding their core area, the Eastern heartland.
Right. The Eastern core. Those main cities in the Levant, Tyre, Sidon, Byblos, Arwad, Tel Dor. The homeland hubs.
But they weren't always politically free, were they? The sources mention big challenges, especially from Assyria.
Assyrian domination was huge from the 9th to 7th centuries BCE. Heavy taxes, tribute. It led to revolts sometimes, which were brutally put down.
But here's the paradox, right? Assyria needed them.
Exactly. That's what's so interesting. Assyria was this massive land power, incredible army,
Yeah.
but they had no real navy of their own.
So they dominate the Phoenicians politically, tax them, but rely on their ships.
Utterly dependent on Phoenician ships and sailors for anything maritime. Moving goods, troops, projecting power by sea. It's a fascinating dynamic.
Economic leverage even when politically subordinate.
Precisely. Assyria became a sea power by proxy, using the Phoenician fleets. It kept the Phoenicians vital, even without sovereignty. But it also complicates the archaeology. Is this stuff trade, or tribute, or spoils of war? Hard to tell sometimes.
And the cities didn't all react the same way to Assyrian pressure?
No. Different strategies. Byblos seems to have aimed for peace, cooperation. Tyre and Sidon were often more resistant, leading to sieges and conflict. Internal politics mattered too.
Okay, let's look outwards from the homeland. Key regional partners. Egypt comes up a lot.
The connection with Egypt was deep, not just goods, but significant cultural exchange. Phoenician art and religion show a huge amount of Egyptian influence.
Can you give an example?
The sarcophagus of King Ahiram of Byblos, 10th century BCE, he's shown on a throne with winged sphinxes, totally Egyptian, holding a drooping lotus flower, another Egyptian symbol.
So they're integrating Egyptian symbols into their own elite culture?
Deliberately, yes. And you see it in ivory carvings too, found at places like Samaria, starting even earlier, 12th century BCE onwards.
And tangible goods were exchanged too? Literature mentions this?
Yes, the Egyptian tale of Wenamun, 11th century BCE. It talks about needing wood from Byblos, mentions Syrian ships regularly bringing cedar to Egypt, shows that long-standing timber trade.
What about the Aegean, Greece, other big sea players?
Definitely interaction there. Shipwrecks off Turkey, Kepsebrenu, Kakova Adasi, 7th, 6th centuries BCE, show mixed cargoes, suggesting Phoenician and Greek merchants were crossing paths.
But the material culture is unbalanced.
It is. You find way more Greek stuff, especially pottery, in Phoenicia and its western colonies than you find Phoenician stuff in Greece.
Interesting. Why would that be?
Well, the thinking is that the main Phoenician exports to the Aegean might have been things that don't survive archaeologically, or were too valuable.
Right.
Like their famous purple dye. Incredibly valuable, but the finished dye or dyed cloth vanishes. Or maybe silver, which they were getting from the west and likely trading eastwards. High-value, low-bulk stuff that doesn't leave the same footprint as pottery sherds.
Right, the invisible exports. That makes sense. And they traded heavily with their immediate neighbors, too. Syria, Israel, Judah.
Absolutely. They were the maritime gateway for these inland kingdoms. That Hiram-Solomon relationship, again, cedar and metals from Tyre, for agricultural goods like wine, oil, grain from Israel. A strategic exchange.
And this continued even after Israel split.
The sources suggest those trade links persisted, yes. And we have that amazing description in the book of Ezekiel, chapter 27, the lament against Tyre.
Oh yes, Tyre as a magnificent ship.
Exactly. Built from precious woods, crewed by experts from everywhere, trading with the whole known world. It's a stunning literary snapshot of Tyre's central role and reach.
Gives you a real sense of scale. Is there archaeology backing this up near the borders?
Yes, sites near the Phoenicia-Israel border, maybe Tel Kabul, show this interaction. Mixed material culture, blended architectural styles from the 10th, 9th centuries BCE. Clear signs of ongoing exchange.
And what about connections between the Phoenician cities themselves? Were they unified?
Rivals? A bit of both, probably. They were distinct city-states, sometimes with different foreign policies, especially towards Assyria. But culturally and economically, they were closely tied. Similar burial practices, pottery styles link places like Telexiv and Tyre.
And Tyre seems like the main hub in the east.
Tyre seems dominant, yes, based on the archaeology. It has the most extensive evidence for wide connections. Though sometimes it's hard to separate Tyre's activity from Sidon's, they were so closely linked.
Okay, so that's the eastern core. Now, Cyprus. The sources really emphasize it wasn't just a trading partner, but integral.
Yes, this is crucial. Cyprus was basically part of the Phoenician world, an extension. The connections go way back, even before the main PTN period. Levantine pottery, weights show up on Cyprus in the late Bronze Early Iron Age transition. Canaanite jars, too.
And this early presence led to actual Phoenician colonies there.
Absolutely. Caption is the big example. A major Phoenician colony established by the 9th century BCE. A real foothold. And this led to deep cultural mixing.
So Cypriot styles influenced by Phoenician burial practices appearing on Cyprus.
Exactly. Parallels with burials in northern Israel, even Lefkandi in Greece. It shows deep cultural integration, not just trade. And things like bichrome Lafitte pottery showing up in both Tyre and Cyprus well into the later periods. It underlines that ongoing close tie, even when Assyria took political control of Cyprus.
Geographically separate, but culturally and economically joined at the hip almost.
That's a good way to put it, a vital stepping stone.
Okay, with that eastern base secure, the next logical step was west, the central Mediterranean.
The crucial crossroads. The push west was about reestablishing and really expanding contacts that might have existed earlier, maybe back in the Bronze Age. And the sources talk about a pre-colonial stage.
Pre-colonial, meaning what exactly?
Meaning an initial phase. Merchants, explorers visiting new areas, making contact, building relationships with locals before setting up formal colonies, testing the waters, establishing rapport, learning about resources.
Scouting missions, basically. Build bridges before you build cities. Makes sense. But dating these earliest Western trips is tricky. Classical stories versus archaeology.
Yes, that's a classic debate. Some ancient writers give very early dates for places like Gadir in Spain. But the widespread archaeological evidence for, substantial settlements tends to be later. It's about interpreting those first finds, fleeting visits, trading posts, or full colonies.
Right. But regardless of the absolute earliest date, the Central Med became vital. And the star player there was Carthage.
Carthage, modern Tunisia, founded by Tyre. And that founding story, with Queen Alyssa or Dido stopping at Cyprus,
reinforces the Cyprus connection again.
It does. It implied Cyprus was already part of Tyre's sphere, able to provide supplies, even settlers, for this major undertaking.
And even the founding journey followed the existing network paths. And Carthage boomed.
It did. Strategic location, halfway between east and west, perfect control point. And the Tyrian expertise of his people? It quickly became a massive trading hub, an entrepot.
Receiving goods, storing them, sending them on.
Exactly. And the archaeology of Carthage reflects this. It's incredibly cosmopolitan. Finds from Italy, Sicily, Sardinia, Malta, Greece, the Levant. It screams crossroads.
Showing all the different trade routes converging there. And Carthage started to get independent?
By the 7th century BCE, it grew so powerful, so wealthy, it began asserting its own identity, becoming more independent from Tyre.
What about other key spots in the Central Med?
Sicily.
Sicily was important. Mocha, near modern Marsala, was a key colony. Interesting architecture there, a dual harbor system, one inland protected, one facing the sea.
Maybe for different kinds of ships or cargo.
Possibly. And its finds show trade with Italy, Sardinia, Carthage, Greece, Proto-Corinthian pottery turns up there. Mocha later fell under Carthaginian control, showing Carthage's growing power.
Sardinia, too. Strong Phoenician influence from the 9th century.
Yes, Sardinia was vital, maybe linked to earlier contacts. Sardinian silver has been found back east. The Norah stone, 9th century inscription, is often debated as early evidence of presence or settlement.
Key sites there. Thilsis seems a major entry point for Levantine goods. Santambinia shows early imports, too. Norah, Bithyia, Thoros. Several important settlements.
And the interaction with the local Nuragic people was different, more mingling.
That seems to be the case, yes. The archaeology suggests more interaction, cohabitation, shared culture, rather than just displacement, which likely helped the Phoenicians access the island's metals and other resources.
Malta also fits in here.
Yes, Melita, modern Malta. A colony by the 8th century, maybe with earlier pre-colonial contact. Another strategic island stopover.
Okay, now Italy's different. The sources say fewer actual colonies there.
That's right. You find Near Eastern stuff in Italy early on, 10th century, showing trade contact. but not the same pattern of widespread settlement building as on the islands or North Africa. A different interaction model.
More trade-focused, less colonization.
Seems like it. Consistent trade relations and significant cultural influence without lots of colonies.
Like Italians adopting Phoenician traditions.
Yes, especially among Etruscans and others. Material culture, maybe production techniques like pottery, even religious ideas potentially. Strong influence, but a lighter colonial footprint. Shows they could adapt their approach.
Flexible strategy. Colonize here, trade and influence there. Which brings us to the edge, the far west. The Atlantic, Iberia.
The far west. Edge of their known world and incredibly important, the main driver. Resources. Metals.
Iberia was famous for metal.
Hugely famous.
Yeah.
Especially silver, but also copper. Tin crucial for bronze and gold. The stories about Iberian silver were legendary, a massive pull factor.
And the key site out there is Gadir, modern Cadiz, with those potentially very early dates from classical authors.
Gadir is central, yes. Paterculus gives that 1104 BCE date. Strabo suggests it was ancient too. But archaeology, well, it's tough. Ancient Gadir is buried under modern Cadiz.
Hard to dig.
Very. So the widespread evidence we have for sustained Phoenician activity in the area, like from Huelva nearby, points more towards the 10th century BCE. Maybe a big push west once Tyre itself was stable again after the Bronze Age chaos.
So the legends might reflect earlier contact, but the big settlement push was a bit later.
That's a common interpretation, yes. Those early dates might be reconnaissance, small posts, not the major colony. And Castillo de Doña Blanca, near Cadiz, is vital archaeologically.
Because it's accessible. Gives us a window into that early Western settlement.
Exactly. Helps fill the gaps from Gadir.
Okay, let's look at the wider Western network. What roles did other colonies play?
Gadir was the main hub, the entrepot, probably the political center for the West. Sites nearby, like Doña Blanca, show standardized pottery emerging, like those Circuito del Estrecho wares from the 7th century.
Circuito del Estrecho. Straight circuit, meaning around Gibraltar.
Pretty much. Found from Portugal down to Ibiza, suggests an integrated production and distribution system in that western zone.
What about up into Portugal and Huelva?
Sites like Abul in Portugal were likely founded from Gadir. Pottery links show that. Controlling coastal routes. Huelva was crucial for metals. We find Phoenician architecture. Pottery from the 8th century there. Real colonization. And a shift from copper focus to silver after they arrived. Silver was the prize.
And the Malaga area, east of Gadir, specialization there too?
Seems so. Serra de Villar looks agricultural, exporting pottery too. Toscana's had ironworking, pottery, and a big storage building suggests a trade center. Mora de Mesquitilla had metal workshops early on, 8th century. Different sites doing different things, supporting each other.
A mini network within the West, and Ibiza.
Sacaleta on Ibiza, founded later, maybe 630 BCE, likely by Gadir folks. Its archaeology points almost purely to metal processing, importing ore from the mainland. Later moved to Ibiza Bay.
And south into North Africa?
Yes, Lixus, Mogador, down the Moroccan Atlantic coast. 7th, 6th centuries, pottery connects them back to the Iberian colonies, extending that Atlantic reach.
Now, a huge part of this Western story is the interaction with the local Iberians. Why was that so important?
Two main reasons, according to the sources. First, access. Locals knew the inland routes, could bring resources from deeper in the peninsula. Second, justification and facilitation. Access to those rich metals often depended on relationships with the people already there.
And it wasn't just one way, it was reciprocal trade.
Definitely. Iberians got Eastern goods, luxuries, tools for their raw materials, mostly metals. The stelae from southwestern Iberia are fascinating here.
The carved stones, how do they show this?
Well, the early ones show local items. But over time, the images shift. They start showing mostly Eastern imports. Combs, fancy pins or fibulae, lyres, mirrors, even carts.
Wow, so owning these imports became a status symbol for the local elite.
It really looks that way. Shows how important this trade became for local power structures. It led to significant cultural blending or acculturation.
You see indigenous sites changing, getting bigger, adopting Phoenician stuff.
Yes, in places like the Tajo Valley around Seville, sites grow, show more wealth, and adopt Phoenician material culture, even religious practices.
Let's break down that cultural impact. Agriculture first.
Phoenicians brought or intensified key crops. Wine grapes, olives huge later on. New cereals, fruits, legumes too. And importantly, the tools and tech to farm better, especially iron.
Iron tools making a big difference.
Big difference. Improved farming, supported by Phoenician iron production know-how, a key tech transfer.
What about crafts, artisan production?
They influenced local styles, introduced new pottery techniques like red slip finishes, brought skills in glass, ivory carving. These likely spread, enriching local material culture.
And architecture, urban planning, that seems fundamental.
It is. While locals often kept traditional styles, some Iberian sites, especially those deep in the trade, adopted Phoenician ideas. Rectilinear walls, lime plaster, pier and rubble construction. More planned layouts at sites like Aldavesta, Torre del Calvary.
Why adopt foreign building styles? Just copying.
Maybe partly, but the sources suggest it was also functional. Trade brings wealth, more people. Old structures might not cope. Phoenician techniques allowed bigger, more organized settlements, better for storage, managing trade, larger populations, practical solutions for elites managing change.
And finally, religion. Cult practices.
Yes, clear evidence for adoption of Phoenician religious elements, especially around Seville, Carmona. Finds like oxide altars, cattle horns, Phoenician-style figurines suggests deep integration, seeing Phoenician gods perhaps as linked to the trade's power and wealth.
So it went way beyond just swapping goods. It shaped how people lived, built, worshipped.
Exactly. Iberia wasn't just a resource mine. It became a zone of intense cultural interaction and transformation. The PTN wasn't passive. It actively changed the regions it connected with.
This whole massive network, traced mainly through stuff. Pottery, mostly.
Material culture is key, yeah.
Mm.
Pottery, art, tools, burial styles. That's language archaeologists use. Where things were made, where they ended up, how styles changed. It maps the connections.
You mentioned a Phoenician brand in pottery.
Sort of. Certain types, standardized forms, made for export, from places like Teldor. Recognizable Phoenician wares turning up everywhere signals their presence. And Cyprus is involved again.
As like a secondary distributor of Levantine styles.
Pretty much. Cypriot pottery was so heavily influenced it almost becomes an extension of the Levantine tradition, and it gets distributed widely through the network. Sometimes hard to tell a Cypriot piece from a Levantine one found out west.
And in the West, unique local styles developed within the network.
Yes. Those Circuito del Estrecho wares we mentioned, developed around Gibraltar after the 8th century, produced locally but standardized, found from Portugal to Ibiza until the mid-6th century. Clearly maps that Western internal trade zone.
Standardization implies real coordination, doesn't it?
It does. And the Cruz del Negro earns a Western burial urn style based on Eastern prototypes. Their distribution suggests shared practices or connections. And the Western R1 amphora, a local transport jar, common in the West, rare back east. Local adaptation.
So how do we trace the links between the big regions using this, east to central, central to west?
East to central. Carthage is the main conduit. You find Eastern Phoenician pottery, other imports. At Carthage, Sicily, Sardinia Sulcis had loads of Eastern stuff, Malta, dating back to the pre-colonial phase even.
Okay. And central out to the far west.
That's interesting. You find connections, but direct imports from Carthage itself seem less common way out west near Gadir. But other links exist. Shared burial types, like shaft and chamber tombs, pop up in Carthage, Utica, Cyprus, and southern Iberia, like Almuñécar. Similar grave good layouts, too.
And the lack of Carthaginian imports in the Gadir area. Maybe the West was self-sufficient internally.
That's one idea. If the Western colonies around Gadir had their own efficient production and distribution like the Circuito wares, maybe they just didn't need as many basic imports from Carthage, even if Carthage was their main link back east overall. Shows a mature Western sphere.
What about direct east-west links, skipping the middle?
Archaeologically very hard to prove. Literary sources, like Solomon and Tarshish, might imply direct long voyages. But the archaeological trail mostly shows Eastern goods arriving west via the central hubs, especially Carthage. Distinguishing direct from indirect is tough if goods were traded multiple times. Direct was possible, sure, but the network structure seems heavily reliant on those central nodes.
So, pulling it all together, this wasn't random sailing. It was structured, complex.
Highly structured. A dynamic system moving goods, people, ideas, tech, culture across the Med and into the Atlantic.
With key hubs. Tyre in the east, Carthage in the middle, Gadir anchoring the west.
Yes. And strong internal connections within each zone, like that Western pottery network. And that Western network showed resilience, didn't it? It kept going even when the Eastern cities declined under Assyrian and later empires.
The center of gravity shifted west.
It seems so. Until that more mysterious transition in the 6th century BCE, when many Western colonies were abandoned, that's still debated.
The fact the West outlasted the East says a lot about the strength the colonies, especially Carthage, develop.
It does. Carthage really became the successor, carrying that Phoenician legacy forward in the West.
Looking back, the scale, the ingenuity, it really is an amazing example of ancient globalization, ancient enterprise.
It truly is. Their ability to navigate, connect across cultures, build settlements, manage this complex flow of everything, it's extraordinary for the time, driven by trade.
And even with gaps in the evidence, the archaeology and texts, like in that thesis, paint such a vivid picture, a system that fundamentally shaped the ancient Mediterranean.
Absolutely, a powerful reminder of how interconnected the ancient world really was. Deep roots of global trade and cultural exchange.
This deep dive really shifts your perspective, doesn't it? So the takeaway, what does it all tell us? Maybe something about that enduring human drive to connect, to trade, even amidst instability.
Perhaps, or the complex dance between trade, colonization, cultural change.
Yeah.
Lessons there throughout history.
Right. And what can we learn from the rise and eventual shift of a system so dependent on widespread trade, looking at our own globalized world?
Those are the big questions, aren't they? How did this network influence later powers, later routes? And what vulnerabilities or strengths does studying this ancient system reveal about interconnectedness itself, then and now?
Definitely a lot to think about there. Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the truly fascinating world of the Phoenician trade network.
My pleasure. It was a remarkable system to explore, full of human innovation and connection.
Until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep diving deep.